China's relations with Japan and Russia. We'll start with Japan first. Despite high levels of trade and investment and sharing a similar culture, China and Japan's relations are plagued by mutual mistrust and occasionally by hostility. These occasionally manifest themselves in public protests in China. The source of China's mistrust of Japan are twofold. First, Japan's imperial pasts and attempts to conquer China or China's allies. And second, concerns that the U.S. is preparing to enable Japan to militarily rearm or acquire nuclear weapons. The first instance of Japanese-Chinese hostility was when China's Tang Dynasty intervened to assist a faction in the Silla Kingdom that was resisting the invasion from Japan during the Yamato period. Although at this time Japan was the weaker party, in fact it was a vassal of Silla. It culminated in the Battle of Baekgang in 1663. The Tang Dynasty successfully expelled Yamato from the Korean Peninsula for 900 years. There was after a period of endemic piracy. The early Wokou or piracy period was identified as coming from Japan, according to Chinese scholars, and it was suppressed in part with the help of Japan. The Chinese frequently referred to the Japanese as Iron or dwarves. Recent evidence from graveyards indicates that most of those pirates were actually Chinese fishermen who, either for economic incentive purposes or because they were poor, would move several hundred kilometers up or down the coast and then join one of these Japanese-led gangs. And they would adopt a Japanese name, which led to the impression that all of the pirates were Japanese. After the Sengoku period in Japan, which is the Warring States period, there's a large civil war in which millions died. There was a period of stability after this long conflict and a great many soldiers, and the society was militarized. Oda Nobunaga was one of the very important warlords, and under his service was a general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who lacked the Minamoto lineage necessary to become a shogun and to rule therefore on behalf of the imperial family. So he thought, once he became the leader of Japan, that if he could acquire military notoriety, then he would be able to acquire the status necessary to govern Japan. His goal was quite ambitious. It was to conquer Korea, then China, and then to go on and conquer India, even though he was not entirely sure where India was. So Japan was unified in 1591 by Hideyoshi. In 1592, he led his first invasion of Korea, and which was defeated with help from the Ming Dynasty. And then in 1597, 1598, he led a second invasion, and then he died shortly thereafter. There were armored ships, there was use of cannon and firearms. It was a fairly technologically advanced invasion if compared to Europe at the same time. At the bottom you can see the Ming Emperor, who intervened on behalf of his Korean allies. Ultimately, the Japanese invasion was defeated by the Ming armies and the Korean Navy. In a dispute over Korea, Japan and China went to war, the Qing dynasty. Japan won very swiftly in 1895, and they completed the occupation of Korea as well as parts of Manchuria, and they took possession of Formosa, what is today Taiwan. In 1898 to 1901, Japan participated in the Eight-Nation Alliance to suppress the Boxer Rebellion in China, which was basically the Qing dynasty deflecting nationalism away from the Manchu leadership of the country against foreigners. And this had not only an impact on the business of the foreigners, but individual foreigners were being targeted, and so the Eight Nations invaded and marched up to capture Peking. In 1931, Japan occupied Manchuria, which they had already partially consolidated after defeating the Imperial Russians in the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. And then in 1937, the Japanese crossed the border, seizing Peking, the capital of China, and then landing Marines at Shanghai. And from 1937, Japan was continuously at war with China until Japan was defeated by the United States in 1945. Japan had a superiority-inferiority complex. On the one hand, it felt that it was much superior to China, culturally, militarily, economically. So the Japanese were concerned, aware that China was typically the strongest country in East Asia, that Japan should adopt policies to make sure it remained on top. So Japan saw itself in the same light as the European powers did, in part with the power to protect themselves by dominating their neighbors and dominating their colonies, but on the other hand also with the responsibility of leading their region. Now, the Japanese felt an inferiority because the European states and the US typically restrained Japan, that Japan felt was unfair. And this was paralleled by the Japanese observing racial policies in the US, where the US would limit Japanese immigration on the basis of ethnicity, limit their ability to get citizenship. And so the domestic press in Japan was very sensitive to what was going on outside of Japan, and this provoked sentiment in Japan against racism by Europeans. So it's a superiority-inferiority complex because it's contradictory. Japan was seeking self-respect, but what they really wanted to do was be respected as a predatorial power like Europe with all of the privileges. So there are two treaties that Japan in particular was hostile to, and the first was the Treaty of Versailles, which concluded the First World War. These were negotiations in Paris, and Japan was generally disregarded. It was a part of the 10 states that started the negotiations, but it wasn't part of the core group. China and Japan both proposed a racial equality proposal to the peace, which was rejected. China was hostile because the Europeans granted German colonies in China to Japan. Japan was hostile because in the 1894-1895 Sino-Japanese War, the Europeans intervened and seized some of the Japanese conquests and returned others to China. The second treaty that Japan reacted negatively was the Washington Naval Treaty of 1822, which was an attempt to stop an arms race between England, France, the US, Japan, by locking their ships at a certain size. And the Japanese felt that this was unfairly holding them behind. Commonsensically, of course, if there was no Washington Treaty, there would be an arms race, and Japan's economy couldn't have sustained it. Although the 1930s inflicted such economic weakness on the West, it delayed their shipbuilding. So perhaps Japan might have exploited that. But in general, there were two constituencies in Japan for and against the Washington Naval Treaty. And the constituency that was supported by the Navy, that was imperial, that saw Japan's destiny and security lying outside of Japan, won over. And ultimately, Japan cheated on the naval limitations specified by the treaty in the construction of some of their very large battleships. A major issue today is apology fatigue. The Japanese people are not that well educated about the events of the Second World War, and they're vaguely aware of the apologies that have been given to China and other countries over many decades. So this is partially a result of how Japan has dealt with the problem of their history in the Second World War differently than Germany. Germany's a lot closer to the other countries, and while support for Adolf Hitler was above 50% until 1960, when that particular generation died off, Japan has not reconciled itself with the damage it inflicted on its neighbors to the same extent. Now, China shifted away from a communist historical ideology taught in the schools after the Tiananmen Square massacre of June 4th, 1989, because communism was becoming less important as a motivator and as a source of legitimacy for the Communist Party in Beijing. So they shifted to anti-Western and anti-Japanese propaganda. And so the focus of the newspapers and the people in China was to ask the Japanese penance. Now, Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka had apologized to Mao Zedong, and Japan did apologize in 1982 for the Nanjing massacre. But in 1992, the legislature of Japan declared that there was an end to apologies. So most other countries like South Korea and China don't feel that Japan has done enough to apologize, but the Japanese have a apology fatigue. They're tired, and it's only a minority want Japan to continue to apologize. A major concern for China is the rearmament of Japan. Article 9 of Japan's constitution prohibited it from having or using instruments of war, even for defense. The U.S. signed a mutual security treaty in 1951 and 1960. China sees this as a sort of a management alliance which helps restrain Japan. Nevertheless, China, along with South Korea, fears that Japan could rearm very quickly. China and South Korea are concerned that Japan will become a nuclear weapons state. Here you can see Japan's nuclear reactors. Although Japan has been shutting down a number of the reactors because of the Fukushima disaster following the tsunami, the Japanese have the knowledge of nuclear energy and nuclear physics to certainly build nuclear weapons on short order. So the U.S. encouraged Japan to set up a self-defense force, not a military, during the Cold War, designed to repel a Soviet ground attack on Hokkaido and a Soviet naval and air interdiction of shipping around Japan. Now, since the end of the Cold War, the Self-Defense Force, the SDF, has progressively grown in sophistication, and although comprising 1% of Japan's GDP, which is the accepted spending limit, defense spending totals about $55 billion from about 2000 to 2020. In 1995 to 2004, Tokyo agreed for the first time to have deployments outside of Japan and to assist the U.S. in the contingency of a war over Korea or Taiwan, and to develop a missile defense system. In fact, one of my acquaintances, and in fact friends, is a Japanese intelligence officer who works in the Missile Defense Organization. In 2006, the SDF branches were united under the Defense Ministry for the first time since the Second World War. Japan's SDF is probably the best equipped military in Asia. The Navy comprises 4 Aegis-class destroyers, which are the most efficient systems in the world for air defense. Japan's ships are equipped to shoot down low Earth orbit satellites, as well as missile interception. So let's compare the buildup in Japan between 2012 and 2023. And we can see here in comparison to China. Now, already in 2000, Japan realized that China was going to build aircraft carriers. So while China had basically tested and then deployed their first carrier, Japan deployed 3. Now, Japan's carriers are much smaller because Japan's goal is not to fight in the open ocean of the Pacific, but to provide local quick air cover and marine support and helicopter support and anti-submarine warfare support in conjunction with the U.S. among the Japanese islands. So the Japanese very quickly built 3 helicopter carriers. These were originally classified as cruisers because it was technically illegal for Japan to have aircraft carriers, but there was sufficient political support that the Constitution was simply ignored. Now, Japan's always had a very large navy. In fact, it had 29 destroyers, which are very large surface warships, and in fact, more than China. Probably in the year 2000 or even 2010, Japan could have single-handedly defeated the Chinese fleet at sea. Now, in 2023, things have changed significantly. Japan now has 6 helicopter carriers, one of which is being configured to operate the F-35 stealth aircraft from the US, and Japan is manufacturing those at home. You can see at the bottom the 2 Hyuga helicopter carriers, the 2 Izumo carriers, which are being refitted for a short takeoff and landing with the F-35s, and the 2 Osomi LHD amphibious ships that can carry 500 soldiers, but could also carry F-35s if need be. So Japan has 6 light carriers. Although Japan has been building destroyers in the last decade, China has equaled it. So China's gone from 13 old destroyers to 36 modern destroyers. And China has kept approximately the same number of frigates and fast attack craft. So China's navy is modernizing, and under current balance of capability, it would be a very, very tough fight for Japan. Japan no longer has the advantage. But of course, Japan would operate in conjunction with the US. As far as the US concern goes, Japan brings more naval power along the littoral than the US Navy. So Japan is a key ally. US aircraft carriers could certainly operate in the depths of the Pacific or in the Indian Ocean, cutting China off from world commerce. But for naval operations close to the littoral, Japan's contribution would be critical. It would actually be equal to that of the US. We can see here the buildup in submarines from 2012 to 2023. Japan's got a slight decrease in the number of diesel-electric submarines, a decrease in the number of P-3 aircraft, and it's got its own P-1 jet-propelled anti-submarine warfare and maritime reconnaissance aircraft, and approximately the same number of anti-submarine warfare submarines. China's actually gotten rid of some of its older submarines, but the big change for China is 200, or rather 20 KQ-200, which are maritime surveillance aircraft just like the P-1. So Japan and China are keeping pace as far as submarines go. In aircraft comparison, in 2012 there was parity. China had older aircraft, Japan had more modern aircraft, Japan had better airborne early warning, and if China was going to bring the fight to Japan, then Japan would have the advantage of faster sortie rates, closer to ground radar, closer to air defense. But now, in 2023, even though Japan is acquiring stealth fighters in the form of F-35s, the total number of 6th generation aircraft, which are the 50 J-50s, and the 5th generation carrier aircraft, the 50 J-15s, as well as the very large number of J-11s, J-10s, and the Sukhoi 27s, Sukhoi 30s, and Sukhoi 35s would overpower Japan's Air Force. So here, Japan would be very dependent on U.S. air defense assistance. In terms of airborne early warning aircraft, we see the same change. In 2012, Japan had a decisive advantage in airborne early warning, and in 2023, there's parity, approximately. The Japan's got the more sophisticated systems, but China's added 25 KJ-500s in just a decade. And these aircraft are crucial for coordinating the air fight. They're the most valuable airplane in an air force. So we have Japan building up its aircraft carriers. Here you can see the 2 aircraft carrier designs, the larger and the smaller one, and the larger one is intended for the F-35. And Japan was exploring its own indigenous stealth aircraft. It already manufactures its own light interceptor. Japan's relations with China fell precipitously after China's firing of missiles over Taiwan in 1995 to influence the elections. China's rapid economic rise forced a reformulation of Japan's foreign policy in 2001 and 2006, and consequently, in 2003 to 2005, Japan shifted its overseas development assistance, ODA, to India in order to cultivate it as an ally. And Japan has cultivated other allies in East and Southeast Asia in order to improve its relative alliance strength against China. In 2022, Japan came out with the National Defense Strategy, which intends to raise defense spending from 2% to 3% of GDP by 2027. And the arsenal purchased would include long-range missiles capable of striking targets within North Korea and China. Japan spent very little on its defense, right up until 1975. That was just a natural need to replace the equipment in the self-defense forces. A big leap occurred under Nakasone between 1980 and 1990. Nakasone, Prime Minister of Japan, was a Cold Warrior, a strong ally of the U.S. and U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl in Europe. So it was generally a conservative, neoliberal governments in the world who were standing up to communism, and he joined that. So he brought Japan's defense spending up to almost 2%, where it stayed for a very long time. What we now have is a move that's going to increase the defense spending from 2% to 3% by 2027. So Japan's material outlays are going to increase by 50% in the next few years. So there are a couple of issues. The first are maritime disputes. China's been increasingly aggressive to assert control over its littoral waters. This has been manifested by its aggressive intrusion into the territorial waters of its neighbors and to impede surveillance vessels of foreign navies. China actually disputes the ownership of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in Japan, particularly since they may be proximate to energy deposits and they give access to Japan to China's continental shelf, which has economic implications. Because if you have a body, a terrestrial body on a continental shelf, you can then claim economic resources on the continental shelf. And if you're not on the continental shelf, even if you're close, you can be excluded. You can see here the very small Senkaku Islands with a Japanese Coast Guard ship going past it. Now, China's been using a strategy of eroding Japanese resolve by using ships and aircraft, many of them from the Coast Guard, some of them private, and aircraft to intrude around the islands. Now, the Senkakus were noticed in a 1971 UN report. There was a speculation that there was oil in the region, and that's when China first stated its objection. And then in the 1990s, the Japanese government, after having received the islands from the U.S., purchased it from a private owner so that the government of Japan would take responsibility for it. And there have been several incidents of nationalist Chinese from Hong Kong landing on the islands illegally, being arrested. And then you'd have demonstrations in China, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong simultaneously, indicating that Senkakus are an ideational issue that unites all Chinese. You can see the Senkakus in the map on the bottom left. It's the yellow, or the blue dot inside the red inset circle. You can see the Ryukyu Islands, which are on the map, and you can see the different facilities there and the different airfields. SDF are self-defense forces. There is air, which is ASDF. Those are aircraft. MSDF, which is maritime, and G is ground. And the center island is, of course, Okinawa. That's where the U.S. Marines and U.S. Air Force is deployed, along with a ground, marine, and air self-defense force. Now, Japan has deployed additional weapon systems to these islands, in particular garrisons. And what you can see in the pictures on the right, on the top, is a mobile anti-ship system, which has been deployed to some of the islands, so that a Chinese fleet trying to get through the straits can be detected and then attacked by these anti-ship missiles. In the middle picture, you can see a Patriot air defense system, which has been deployed on some of the islands. And of course, the Japanese have soldiers on the ground to stop a Chinese marine landing. But if you look at Okinawa, it's about as far from Japan as it is from China. So it will not be easy for Japan to protect it. Here's another representation of the Ryukyu Islands. You can see where the Senkakus are, and you can see how these islands go all the way up to Taiwan. And about half of the islands contain air bases, as do all of the islands identified here. So, especially Ishigaki, which is an island that's very close to Taiwan, it has the largest assets for stopping ships and aircraft. So you can see this, for China, this is a logistical chain, or a barrier that would protect ships coming from the Philippine Sea to resupply Taiwan in the event of a conflict. And these would interdict Chinese aircraft and ships that would be trying to stop or interdict the American resupply effort. Here again are the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. You can see how they're sitting on the continental shelf, which gives Japan special claims economically. Again, you can see the exclusive economic zone, which is important for China because it allows them to claim all the energies, the fisheries, the oil or gas that's located there. But with the Senkaku Islands, it allows Japan to make the red-lined claim. And a key dispute is the Chunxiao oil gas field, which is located right on the exclusive economic border claimed by Japan. And there's a dispute here between different warships. So there have been a couple of incidents. In 2004, in the Ishigaki Strait, a Chinese Han-class nuclear submarine passed by, and it surfaced just to show Japan that it was passing by. Now, this is now routine. Chinese ships go through the Japanese archipelago at least once a year, if not several times per year. In 2005, the Chunxiao gas field, which you can see depicted in the map on the right, 5 People Liberation Army naval ships of China locked onto a Japanese Self-Defense Force maritime patrol aircraft. This has happened several times as well. In 2007, Chinese ships refused the Japanese Coast Guard inside Japanese waters, and so they were seized, and there was a dispute. Again, you can see the Senkakus there, where there's sort of an application of tactics of erosion, where the Japanese keep pushing, and then the Japanese Coast Guard keeps responding. In 2010, a JCG collision with a Chinese fishing vessel occurred. This is a Japanese Coast Guard ship. The Chinese ship captain was arrested. On a number of occasions, the Japanese Self-Defense Force aircraft have scrambled from Okinawa against People's Liberation Army Air Force launches near Chunxiao gas field. The Japanese straits are important because they are major thoroughfares for shipping. There's the Tsugaru, which is the straits between Hokkaido and Honshu. It's not shown on a map. There's, of course, Tsushima, which is between Kyushu and Korea. There's Osumi, which is within the Kyushu Islands, and Soya, which is between Hokkaido and Sakhalin, of course, is controlled by the Russians. A second issue is war crimes. Now, Japan has been domestically reluctant to address its role during the Second World War. Japan's occupation of China killed between 13.5 to 23 million Chinese, mostly as a function of starvation. Japan also made use of chemical and biological warfare weapons. Now, in 1993, there was an official imperial regret for the atrocities and for World War II, but they were unspecific and they were not an apology. Although Japan's prime minister did apologize in 1993. But that's the last time Japan's imperial family or a prime minister has offered a regret. During the Second World War, Japan operated Unit 100 and Unit 731, which conducted unconscious vivisections on its Chinese subjects as a part of a biological warfare plan. And there were many applications of this plan to stop guerrilla warfare, to disrupt regions where the Chinese armies were passing through, to attack areas that were thought to be providing support to the Kuomintang. In one experiment, the Japanese infected a village of 5,000 persons with the plague using mosquitoes and rats in a large-scale controlled epidemiological experiment at the city of Changchun. This is a letter from Major Ishii Shiro, initiator of the Japanese biological research in China, to his superiors in late 1932. Quote, "Due to your great help, we've already achieved a great deal in our bacteria research. It is time we start to experiment. We appeal to be sent to Manchukuo to develop new weapons." Close quote. And so you can see here an autopsy of a dead experimental victim. You can see the camp, Japanese Unit 731 complex at Pingfan in China. And you can see a Chinese victim with being infected by the plague. The Japanese experimented also on captured Russians. So it was a fairly broad and brutal experimental process. This is a banquet of the Japanese doctors from Unit 731 during the China War. Not a single one of these individuals was ever arrested or punished. The U.S. granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for sharing of their biological warfare experiments, which they did. Most of these ended up being doctors or administrators of major hospitals in Japan. When in 2005, Japanese school textbooks downplayed the 1937 Nanjing massacre, it led to widespread anti-Japan protests across China. Japan admits to the massacre of the Chinese army, but does not concede that the civilian massacre occurred. Now, the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo is a memorial to Japan's war dead and is frequently visited by important political figures, including the Japanese Prime Minister and the Emperor. It also houses 14 Class A war criminals, or the ashes of them, and is a focal point for Japan's reluctance to show contrition. Here's the Yasukuni Shrine, established in 1879. It contains little containers of the ashes of the warriors, or the memories of warriors that had fallen. This is the Yasukuni Shrine from a tourist brochure for visitation. These are Japanese soldiers during the Second World War visiting the Yasukuni Shrine. Shinto priests at Yasukuni Shrine. A sumo wrestling event at Yasukuni Shrine, because this is considered a sacred ritual. Here's a Japanese Prime Minister visiting the Yasukuni Shrine. Here's a collection of right-wing Japanese nationalists. More nationalists. So there are 2.4 million enshrined kami, including 1,000 Class B and C war criminals, mostly from the Second World War. This is the Mimizuka Korean Nose Shrine in Kyoto. That was set up in 1597 to memorialize the Japanese soldiers that fought and died in Hideyoshi's invasion of Japan. There are 185,738 Korean heads and 29,014 Chinese heads, for a grand total of 214,752 Korean and Chinese heads spread throughout Japan at various shrines. Japan has repeatedly been asked by Korea, and Korea's asked the U.S. to intercede in order to repatriate these human remains. The Japanese took these remains, the noses and the ears and the heads, in order to count how many of the Korean population, whether soldiers or civilians or Chinese, were killed in battle. Now, the idea that Japan is exclusively engaging in these types of atrocities is not accurate. In 1894-1895, when the Japanese and the Chinese were fighting over Korea, there were some engagements where China won. And we see cases where Chinese military units would return to Peking with collections of Japanese heads. So we could say that the lack of atrocities by Chinese soldiers has a lot more to do with the fact that most of the time that there was a fight, the Japanese were fighting in Chinese areas or Korean areas where there were civilians, and the Chinese were not fighting on Japanese territories. But the idea that some Chinese soldiers were not emulating some Japanese soldiers is not accurate. Now, the next issue is, of course, Taiwan. Japan publicly abides by the one China policy, the idea that Taiwan is not independent and that Taiwan and China should resolve their differences peacefully. But there is a concern in Beijing that it would support an independent Taiwan. Japan does fear that the loss of Taiwan will give China access to the Pacific and will make the Yellow Sea and the China Sea China's internal lake, threatening Japanese sea lanes. So you can see Japan is located here, and you can see the dashed line that goes through Kadena Air Force Base along the Ryukyu Islands, then goes to Taiwan, and then through Luzon, and then through the South China Sea. The first island chain is a Chinese claim on territorial waters they want to control strategically. And then they would want to push the U.S. and Japan past the second island chain. The U.S., of course, has a base at Guam, represented here as Saipan, Tinian, and Andersen Air Force Base, as well as Palau, and of course Japan's got a base on Iwo Jima. So Japan's goal is obviously to keep Taiwan as a part of the democratic Western alliance because it acts like a plug, making it strategically very costly for China to move a naval force from China past Taiwan, because with Taiwan it's easy to interdict. If China were to control Taiwan, then it could move its ballistic missile submarines and its fleets easily out into the Pacific between the gaps of the second island chain. So it's primarily a strategic expedient, but it's also ideological because Taiwan has historical ties with Japan, and many Taiwanese have very favorable views of Japan despite their relatively brutal occupation. Japan did develop the island significantly. A major issue for Japan, of course, is the stagnating economy linked to its stagnating population. The economy has not grown since 1991, and this is, of course, a security problem, a strategic problem. Japan's GDP of around 4 trillion hasn't changed since the early 1990s. So it's been 30 years of stagnation. And part of it is cultural. Japan is stuck around 40,000 per capita income, and Korea's caught up to Japan. And the problem in Japan is just it's a lack of commercial judicial systems that allowing for startups and for innovation. So Japan's not been able to move up the product cycle, and it's lost the lower end of the product cycle to more innovative producers like South Korea. And you can see here the working age population in decline in Japan, which it started declining in 1995, and it's basically on a precipitous decline because the total fertility rate in Japan is very low, and thus far Japan has not come up with a solution to that problem. There's of course a lot of strategic interest in Japan. You can see here a war game from Japan that focuses on the type of naval maritime disputes that are likely to occur. You can also see the Japanese military, picture on the top left, interacting with the militaries of other countries in the region. So let us look now at Russian-Chinese history. The Russian conquest of Siberia brought them into contact with the Manchu, which is the Qing dynasty, resulting in a border conflict from 1652 to 1689, in which the Cossacks were kept out of the fertile Amur region. The Qing dynasty was strong, but preoccupied with conquering China and its southern neighbors, the Manchu did not make a move against Siberia. This was confirmed by the 1689 Treaty of Nerchinsk, reconfirmed by the Treaty of Kyatka in 1727. The defeat of the Qing in 1858 during the Opium War led Russia to seize the Amur region, as well as the Primorye, extending all the way down to Vladivostok. So you can see the map of Russia. Obviously, the green areas are show higher altitudes. Now you can see in the center, just east of the Ural Mountains, the West Siberian Plain. And the problem with the plain here is it's essentially a lava field. At the top of it, the north of it, on the water's edge, is where Russia's got a lot of its oil fields. And there's a railway system on the southern edge, or the bottom edge of Russia, that runs all the way across the map to Vladivostok. Now, most of the Russian population lives as far as Lake Baikal, which is the large lake you can see on Russia's southern border in the eastern side of the map. So the Amur region, you can see the Amur River, which is near the cardinal points, and it sort of it goes out into the Sea of Okhotsk, but you can see the border continuing down to Vladivostok. That region there is far more fertile than the region north of it. So when the Russians first showed up, they couldn't get into the Amur region, which is fertile. They were stuck in the taiga. The taiga is that latitude that occurs in very cold countries where you get basically only pine trees growing. And the problem with pine trees is their nettles are fairly acidic, and so you can't farm there. And so to get desirable farming land, the Russians had been pushing south for over 200 years to get into the Amur Valley, until China was weakened by the Opium War, and then Russia, within 15 years, was able to negotiate the surrender of this territory. Now, it should be pointed out that at that time of the surrender, there were not that many Chinese living in Manchuria, because it was the sacred territory of the Manchu, the leaders of the ethnic Qing dynasty. And so they actually restricted Chinese entry. So it wasn't China giving up national territory, but it was China giving up territory that, because the Qing are now recognized as a part of China, are seen now as an extension of China. So it is possible one day China will reclaim the Amur region, along with the cities of Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, which are significant Russian urban areas. So Manchuria, which consists of Jilin, Heilongjiang, and Nemongol, which you can see depicted in green here on the map, were very sparsely populated by Tungustic people and was close to Chinese settlement by the Qing. But the Russian conquest of the Amur in 1860 led to the reopening of the lands to Han settlement, and 8 million Chinese settled there from Hebei and Shandong between 1891 and 1942. Japan did the same thing with Hokkaido. Canada did the same thing. It built a lot of railroads going north of the 50-kilometer area along the U.S. border, essentially the St. Lawrence Valley. And so a lot of regions in the world were opened up by railroads pushing north. But in Japan and China, it was in response to Russian immigration into the Amur region. And for the Japanese, it was the Russians moving on to Sakhalin Island, which came with the Amur region. There were originally 75 million Chinese that moved into Manchuria as a part of that migration, but only 8 million stayed. And those 8 million are now the ancestors for the over 100 million Chinese that live there now. Which the 100 million Chinese living in what is today, or what was then Manchuria, are 2/3 of the entire Russian population. So they outnumber the Russian population across the border almost 50-1. So there are a number of Sino-Russian issues, and the first one is territorial disputes in Siberia and the Russian Far East. In 1969, there was the Sino-Soviet border war. This was caused in part by the Cultural Revolution in China and the confidence created by China's nuclear weapons ability, which it had tested in 1964, although China did not have an operational arsenal at the time. So, formerly closest of allies, the Communist China and the Soviet Union drifted apart ideologically after the Soviet Union refused to use nuclear weapons to provoke a war with the West, or specifically to back China in the 1954-58 Taiwan Straits crisis. Now, there are, of course, a whole bunch of other factors, which is Mao Zedong did not like how Khrushchev criticized Stalin and his one-man rule, because Mao's rule was very similar. Mao did not respect Khrushchev, who we saw as a junior leader. And China and Russia had fundamental differences on how to mass mobilize populations. And of course, Mao Zedong didn't like the Russians, including Joseph Stalin, because during the Second World War, the Soviets in desperation backed the Kuomintang, who were the better candidate to resist the Japanese in taking over China. So China tested its first nuclear weapon in 1964, and it was in that year that China began provoking border clashes with the Soviet Union on their common Siberian frontier, although there were disputes going as far back as 1959. Now, China claimed there were a total of 4,189 of these disputes. By 1969, the Chinese Cultural Revolution was approaching its apex, and it was more than likely that this led to the bold Chinese action against the Soviet patrolled border. So here you can see Soviet troops, and on the very bottom you can see a Soviet patrol. So this is the Amur region. That's with the sort of the side hash you could see, and the pink area is where there was one dispute. But you can see the city of Khabarovsk surrounded by a rectangle on the right. That's where the initial dispute happened. So here's a dispute right on the edge of the Mongolian border. This is a zoom-in of Sizu Island, where the contact happened between the Chinese ambushers and the Russian patrolling soldiers. Here's an even closer zoom-in of the island. Here's a typical encounter between the People's Liberation Army and the Soviet patrols along their common border. On March 2nd, 1969, a platoon to company-sized Soviet force crossing the Ussuri River was ambushed and destroyed by a force of Chinese People Liberation Army units on a disputed Hai-Sia-Zu Island opposite the Soviet city of Khabarovsk on the confluence of the Amur and the Ussuri River. The island was in dispute since the 1858 Treaty of Aigun, in which the island was awarded to the Russians. The Soviets and Chinese quickly deployed additional units to the area with combat of up to regimental size. The clashes spread to the Xinjiang border. The fighting was to last until March 15th and was probably concluded by Soviet dominance, particularly in its deployed artillery. China lost a brigade fighting the Soviets in Xinjiang province on August 13th, 1969. On August 28th, China ordered mobilization in provinces around the Soviet Union and Mongolia. What made the event critical was the fact that both China and the Soviet Union at the time were in possession of nuclear weapons, although the Soviet Union had a far more sophisticated and numerous arsenal. There you can see a Chinese patrol in the Gobi Desert. You can see here the island from the Chinese view. Although the clash did not constitute a war, it was large-scale military engagement between frontline military forces. On August 1969, the Soviets leaked an interest to the U.S. of hitting China with a counter-force attack. That is to say, to use conventional and nuclear weapons to destroy China's ability to manufacture nuclear weapons. The U.S. declined to support the Soviet offer. Here you can see People's Liberation Army DF-31 on the left, and a YJ-63 land attack cruise missile on the bottom right. So the Soviet TVD is a front, and it's how the Soviets organized their various armies for an invasion, and this would have been their plan to occupy northeastern China in the event of a conflict with China. And it basically copies their successful 1945 attack on Japanese-held Manchuria at the end of the Second World War. Here you can see the 1945 attack against the Japanese. These were experienced Soviets who had just defeated the armies of Nazi Germany, and so they fell upon the Japanese, who were far less well equipped or trained, and the attack was over in a matter of weeks. This is the Kuropatkin line. Kuropatkin is named after a Russian general, and Russia's and the Soviet Union's grand strategy was to secure the territory up to the Yangtze River, with the logic that this contains 70% of China's population and industry and resources, and Russia wouldn't have to occupy the rest of China. Now, with the Soviet collapse in 1991, there was a demilitarization of borders and a compromise reached on the three islands opposite Khabarovsk. Russia's Far East population is about 38 million, but only 6 million live east of Lake Baikal. Of these, 1.5 million are indigenous people, mostly from the Yakut. Demographically, this population shrank by 10% since the end of the Cold War. It faces 90 million Chinese living in Jilin, Heilongjiang, Liaoning, and内蒙古. There has not been a huge migration of Chinese illegal labor into Russia, although there has been probably about 1 million that have migrated, and a great many migrate over for the purposes of commerce. Earlier, there were predictions that 10 million Chinese would move over and then Russia would lose control of the region, although this has not happened. The Soviets did engage in ethnic cleansing shortly after the consolidation of the Soviet Union against Chinese in Khabarovsk. Now, China's got considerable incentives to expand into Siberia. The Amur region is agriculturally fertile. North of that, Siberia becomes a taiga, but it is mineral wealthy, and there's a large detected oil and gas resource that Russia has not begun to exploit. So this is the Amur region, and the southern part is fertile, and the northern part is in the taiga. Here you can see the population density in China versus the population density, of which there is none, in Russia. So China could probably easily seize the territory were it not for Russian nuclear deterrence. Here you can see a rail link between Beijing and Lake Baikal, and how Russia is also compromised. If China were to take Mongolia, it would then be able to advance into the Russian Far East as well. Irkutsk is the last city, basically indicating the easternmost density of the Russian population. Past or eastward of Lake Baikal, you have very small Russian population density. These are the various mineral resources within Mongolia that could be of interest to China. Now, Mongolia achieved its independence from the Qing dynasty in 1912. That's a year after the revolution. And the Chinese were unable to consolidate it. So it is possible that China may one day reassert control over Mongolia, which does not have a very large population. There are, of course, oil resources in Siberia, so you can see the maroon area. Now, in the Russian Far East, you've got the light brown area. That area now does have a confirmation of gas resources. So we could conceive of China taking over the Russian Far East right up to the Urals, including the Russian gas fields just to the northeast of the Ural mountain range. Here's another representation of that type of expansion. It would give China access to soil in Russia that would be opened up by climate change, as well as giving China access to the ballistic missile submarine bastions of the Okhotsk and the fresh waters that are in Siberia. Rivers that are flowing into the Arctic could be redirected, and it would give China access to the Arctic coast of the Eurasian landmass, giving them access to resources in the Arctic. And there is a small Russian population and an indigenous population there. So here's a closer view of the formal Russian Far East. This is the Sea of Okhotsk, which currently contains the Soviet Delta IV ballistic missile submarines. The Kuril Islands used to be controlled by Japan. They're controlled by Russia, and this allows the Russians to control the outside edge of the Sea of Okhotsk. And you can see a picture of a Delta IV Russian submarine in the region. So there was a military exercise conducted by the Russians called Rostock 2010 to demonstrate Russia's ability to rapidly shift military resources by rail from Europe to the Far East. In 2011, Russia completed the Daqing pipeline and started delivering Siberian crude to China. Japan has a similar interest in Siberian oil and would like to oppose Chinese conquest. Japan occupied Siberia as far west as Lake Baikal during the Russian Civil War. To counteract that, the U.S. Army landed in Vladivostok. The Canadian Army deployed with 16 Field Squadron, among other units. 16 Field Squadron was my engineering squadron, and it had deployed there. However, most of Russian oil is in western Siberia, making it relatively militarily inaccessible to China. So you can see here the railway link between Moscow and Vladivostok. So this is the field where most of Russian oil is located to the northeast of the Ural Mountains. And here again you can see a distribution of the different oil and gas fields in Russia and their proximity to China. So the second issue is Sino-Russian cooperation in Central Asia. The collapse of the Soviet Union created 5 independent Central Asian states. The U.S. interest in accessing regional oil resources, spreading democracy, and expanding NATO's partnership for peace led Russia and China in 1996 to establish the Shanghai Five, which included China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. This was updated into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2001, adding Uzbekistan. The common motive of the members is to manage Islamist unrest and exclude U.S. influence. China's motive was to buttress its control of Xinjiang province, as well as to get an accessible source of oil in the event of a U.S. military blockade interdicting oil from the Persian Gulf to China. Here's a comparison between NATO and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has since added additional observers, partners, and guests. Now, the SCO is far more shallow an organization than NATO. As well, it contains contradictions, like India, for example, which is an observer, but clearly has some strategic issues separating it from cooperation. Central Asia is also important as a source of energy for China. In 2009, the Turkmenistan pipeline began operations. China seeks greater influence in the SCO, but Russia is likely the more trusted member. Although Uzbekistan ejected the U.S. from its airbase at Karshi-Kanabad in February of 2009, and Kyrgyzstan ejected the U.S. from Manas airbase, Kazakhstan also denied Chinese overflights in 2007. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization had limited success in influencing events in Afghanistan, in part because Russia and China concurred with NATO's suppression of Sunni Islamist militants there. Third issue, the depth of Sino-Russian relations. Chinese-Russian relations is a form of soft balancing against U.S. influence. Russia is feeling the exclusionary pressure of the eastward expansion of NATO. China is seeking military technology from Russia and needs Central Asia and Russian oil in the event of a U.S. maritime blockade of China's access to the Persian Gulf. Since China reverse-engineered the Russian Sukhoi 27 aircraft, which were purchased in 1992, into their J-11s, Russia has cut back its exports of arms to China. Although Russia has a powerful navy and army, it is unlikely to provide China support in any large-scale conflict, given its insecurity over future Chinese intentions over the Russian Far East. To compensate for its relative demographic and manufacturing decline in regards to China, Russia has adopted a military defense doctrine which advocates the full-scope use of nuclear weapons. I wrote an article in the Defense Post entitled, "For China, Ukraine is the right crisis at the wrong time." China, in order to succeed strategically, particularly in taking back Taiwan, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Amur region of Russia, or perhaps going farther afield and dominating places like Luzon, they need to have their principal opponents distracted. This is a standard balance of power tactic of distracting third parties that could otherwise intervene. Now, in Japanese history, which is largely what China is copying, the Japanese made all of their strategic gains exactly through this distraction approach. In order to overcome the Chinese in 1894, 1895, the Japanese had fashioned good relations with the English, and the English Navy effectively barred intervention from Germany and France. So the Japanese were able to consolidate their victory. They only had to fight one enemy, and that was China. Their subsequent enemy were the Russians. And again, they had a joint defense treaty with the English, so the British Navy was able to keep out, again, the French and the Germans, allowing the Japanese to take on the Russians single-handedly and then win and then consolidate their gains. During the First World War, the Japanese were able to take German possessions in China, as well as the German possessions in the Pacific Islands, like the Carolines and the Marianas, which gave Japan a large shield of Pacific Islands to defend its interior with. At the end of the First World War, the Allies came back, and then they changed some of that territorial conquest. So the Japanese wanted to adjust the status quo in China. So they invaded Manchuria from Korea in 1931, and then in 1937 they invaded Beijing. And they were taking advantage at that time of the economic downturn in the world, the Great Depression, and the anti-interventionist isolationist governments in most of Europe and North America. When the Nazis began conquering countries in Europe, first taking out the Dutch and then the French, the Japanese could occupy Indochina and Indonesia. And then, when the Germans were fighting the English in North Africa, the British had to essentially reduce the air defense around Singapore. So here was Japan's opportunity. So Japan's logic was, all the Europeans were distracted in a large war in Europe. Even the US, which was not yet in war, was going to fight in the Atlantic, because the Germans were impinging directly on American commerce and wouldn't fight Japan. And in fact, this is true. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, the Americans made Germany their priority. Now, ultimately, the Japanese had miscalculated about the impact of the shock of their attack. The American goal was to stop Japan from taking over China, and the Americans stuck by their policy, cutting off oil when the Japanese engaged in a full occupation of French Indochina, and ultimately Japan was defeated. China cannot win over Taiwan or the Russian Far East or their Yukus alone. If China faces Japan and the US and the rest of the democratic world combined, even if they're not direct participants, but it's backing the US economically, China will lose, even if it's allied with Russia. Allying with Russia and obtaining its food and its fuel is simply going to extend the conflict. Xi Jinping knows this. When Vladimir Putin alerted Xi Jinping that he was going to conduct an operation, Xi Jinping, and this was a month before the conflict started, in February 27th, 28th of 2022, Xi Jinping was not aware of the scale of this operation. So when the conflict started, Russia became committed, and they couldn't uncommit themselves because of audience costs and because Russians cannot abandon ethnic Russians in places like the Luhansk and the Donetsk. So Russia exposed itself and was wearing itself down. And so Xi Jinping pulled back. Xi Jinping was not going to back a Russia at this time. China was not ready, and the Americans and their democratic allies had been galvanized, and the resistance in Ukraine had alerted the Taiwanese and the Japanese. So this has been a warning, and in many ways, Putin's attack on Ukraine has preempted Xi Jinping's long-term plan, which was to have a strong Russia demonstrating and essentially distracting the Europeans from supporting the US. In fact, the opposite's happened. Xi Jinping has now been targeted as the principal threat. Now, despite the conflict, and this is of course a heavily disputed policy goal, China is far weaker if it doesn't have Russian oil and food. Now, the Russians generally support Putin because there is a consensus that Russia needs defensible borders, that Russia is suffering a demographic crisis. Now, How much of that crisis is due to structural reforms that were not implemented by Vladimir Putin in the last 20 years? That is, also something that can be heavily debated. But I think Western strategy, despite all the human rights issues, must be to get Russia on our side. And it means a long-term commitment to slow, painful economic attrition to convince the Russian people to displace Putin. Now, maybe someone who replaces Putin might temporarily be far more aggressive, but with concessions that I'm not specifying, I think it would be possible to bring Russia onto the European side. Certainly, the under 30s in Russia, the majority of them don't support Vladimir Putin, and this is critical. And you can see that in the mobilizations. It typically includes the older men. So Russia's very aware that the support for the regime in the younger generation is slipping away very quickly, and the attack on Ukraine simply cemented their hostility. And so Russia's left with a far less well-educated population for engaging in kind of technocratic work, manufacturing, and research and development to sustain its military state. China, if Russia can be split from it, could be kept quiescent even if it passes by 80% of the U.S.'s economy. I wrote an article entitled How to Win in Ukraine Without Creating a Russia-China Axis in the journal 1945, essentially arguing that there are certain offers we could give to Russia that might mollify them so that Putin would stay in power, that would be sufficient to peel, again, Russia away from supporting China. The Cold War had 1/3 of the world's population, as it does today. So a Cold War with China is going to be much larger. Africa's population at the beginning of the Cold War was 120 million people. Today, it's 1.2 billion. Africa is 10 times as big. Now, there may not be as many nuclear weapons as there were during the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. China's building up its nuclear arms slower. But China's economy is about 5 or 6 times bigger than the Soviet Union's was. So this upcoming Cold War is bigger than the Cold War we already experienced. The Cold War, as big as it was, as many nuclear weapons as were built, was still really only a mini version of what we're going to face now. And so it's very crucial that Russia be peeled away from giving China the resources that would allow it to act belligerently. This is an article I wrote in the National Interest entitled Breaking Up, It's Time to Prepare for Russia's Disintegration. In this article, I don't argue Russia is going to spontaneously disintegrate. Not at all. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union was definitely regional governments and national governments seeking autonomy and ultimately independence because the Soviet state was too weak. The Soviet Union did not intervene in Armenian Azeri fighting while they were still members of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So already the Soviet state had become incredibly ineffective. It was powerful as a military force attacking another country, but domestically the state could not function. It could not allocate resources to maintain stability. What sets Russia aside today is, one, the regions in the Caucasus, like Chechnya, are far better organized and could very quickly declare independence, as well as other sub-national organizations and communities in the Caucasus. As well, China could seize control of the Russian Far East. So rather than wait for this to happen, it's important that we think about what the West's policy should be. And I think that the West should institutionally get involved aggressively in the Caucasus. And this is to alleviate a Russian, Turkish, Iranian-sponsored fight in the Caucasus for influence. Furthermore, the West should consider the mechanics of an intervention in the Russian Far East to keep the Russian Far East Russian and not allow China to take over the Russian Far East. If China took over the Russian Far East, it would imperil the security of North America. I wrote an article in Policy Options entitled Sanctions Against Russia Can Be a Dangerously Inflexible Instrument. And here I made the argument that using human rights violations by Russia, and there are plentiful, including war atrocities, the problem with sanctioning those behaviors is that sanctions, once in place, are very difficult to remove because Western foreign policy is based both on power and on principle. But those who administer the sanctions within government are typically lawyers. In other words, they operate entirely on principle. To sanction Russia indefinitely, which is what's going to happen when you've got lawyers in charge of a sanctions program, because they're never going to lift it until issues like Bucha are addressed and people are brought to the international court. This is going to push Russia into the arms of China. And those issues will never get resolved. And Russia will then be providing oil and food to China, giving it enormous power. Values are very important for democracies. Liberal foreign policy is the main foreign policy. If the world could be turned into a capitalist, commercial, middle-class society where people are buying and selling in the market, then there will be no need for war, and populations will militate against it. But until the democracies have enough power to deal with threats like China, they have to follow the rules of power. And to reject the rules of power is catastrophic. Democracy is not an automatic system of government. There have been historical periods where it's been erased. The French terrestrial threat of Louis XIV and before destroyed Dutch democracy. The self-governing Italian city-states were ripped apart by Spanish, French, and Habsburg incursions that ultimately led to the rise of the Medici princes. So democracy must first focus on power. If there's enough power to back a liberal foreign policy, then certainly it should be pursued because those values ultimately will bring peace. But if liberal values are pursued in the short term, it leads to disaster. I wrote an article entitled China's Possible Cover for Genocide for the Taipei Times, and here I argued that China is very likely to use a war in Taiwan to complete its genocide of the Uyghur people. And I gave some statistics in there about what the current situation is, what the important nodes are to be struck. So I mean, this highlights what is fairly obvious, that Western culture and its foreign policy is essentially liberal, not only because it's the prime moral motivator of Western people, but also because it's the revolutionary ideology that allows democracies to overturn authoritarian states. People living in an authoritarian state want economic stability, but at some point they're going to want postmodern freedom, and only democracy can offer them that. So this is very much the same dilemma we have with Russia, which is where we have a trade-off between liberalism and power. In the case of Russia, if we aggressively sanction Russians, then they're not going to cooperate with the West for at least a generation. With China, on the other hand, we do need to accelerate the specific identification of individuals involved in genocide in China in order to appeal to those in China who are liberal and the friends of democracy.